Our next talk is Hugh McCamphill, and Hugh is talking about from resistance to results, navigating a test automation tool suite. Oh, that was a tool.
Tool shift.
Tool shift, sorry.
Right. If you've been in the industry for any length of time, you'll recognize the change is a constant, whether that's libraries, frameworks, APIs, processes, whatever it might be. Test automation, of course, is no different in that regard. This presentation is a story about how I introduced a change in approach and tooling in the company that I just joined. Now, over the last 20 years or so, I've had the opportunity to work with lots of different APIs and libraries. And as well, of course, of making lots and lots of mistakes, I've also had the opportunity to build up some ideas, biases, and opinions around what good test automation can look like. And some of those biases, I don't think will be too different from a lot of people here in the room today, whether that's things like optimizing for feedback or having whole team engagement in your test automation. One area where things might be a little bit different is around the use of Cucumber. And typically that's because people can have a kind of a love-hate relationship with Cucumber. But let's talk about it just for a moment. So if you go to the Cucumber homepage, you'll get this idea, or you get this documentation around the idea of your specs, your Cucumber scenarios, written in plain language, and then with the idea that because they're written in plain language, anybody can contribute. Now, of course, don't get me wrong, I'm all for the ideas mentioned around communication, collaboration, and trust. Ideas around collaborative discovery, around having your tests actually act as living documentation. These are all really good, healthy things. The question, of course, is, do you need Cucumber to achieve those? Now, despite what some people may have experienced, and despite what I've experienced, there's a little bit more to writing Gherkin than simply putting some of that natural language on the screen. Again, from the Cucumber website, the idea is that your scenario should describe the intended behavior of the system. Your users come to your websites to book a hotel, to make a reservation, to make a payment on an invoice. They do not come to click buttons on your screen. They may have to, but that's a side effect. They certainly don't come to wait for an element to synchronize on the screen. As they succinctly put at the end there, your scenario should describe what you want to happen, not how. We can take a look at a comparison between a what scenario. So first up, we have this user as an active admin who can log in with valid credentials and are redirected to the dashboard. Quite self-explanatory. If we compare that to a corresponding how scenario, immediately see one thing that stands out is you've lost context. Who is the user? We no longer see that they're an admin. They are clicking buttons. They're sending keys to text fields. And ultimately then we see a welcome user 123. Very much scenarios in the language of the UI, the language of the implementation, and not our intended behavior. Of course, this means if something changes in how we never mind login, but just even authenticate to the system, with a lot of tight coupling, that means our scenarios are going to be hard to maintain and prone to flakiness. And there's some of those things, of course, describe a gap between how something could be done, should be done, and what can happen in practice. But there are some things that are a little bit more inherent to, for example, Gherkin. And one of those is around variable sharing, where you get some situations like this, where there's sort of a lot of convoluted language making references to variables, or perhaps you have to store information in the world object, therefore adding to your cognitive load. But either way, there's a lot of contortions that have to happen to make scenarios in the real world. But going back a little, some of the things that you see happening typically is because people haven't spent a bit of time thinking about how to properly abstract. They layer on the Cucumber step definitions, and those layers tend to be quite thin, as I said, over the UI. And people see, they come along, they see a largely procedural step definition, see that it does something similar to what they need to do. They add a variable, copy paste, and before you know it, you get this explosion of step definitions. But if I were to think about where I would be, I think this quote from Luke Daly illustrates things quite a lot. We know our understanding of the application is going to change over time. The application is going to change over time, but our ability to model and reason and think about how we describe the scenarios is going to change over time. So having code all the way up and all the way down will be beneficial as we change and evolve. So you may be saying, so what? So what, you don't like Cucumber? Well, a couple of years ago, I was interviewing for a new position for the company that I'm with. And it became quite transparent fairly early on that they were using Cucumber at that time. And I remember thinking, I wonder, if I join, I wonder how long will it take me to get rid of Cucumber? And whenever you join somewhere, you can't just come in and start changing things immediately. In fact, I would say you're compelled not to. As Jerry Weinberg talks about in his book, The Secrets of Consulting, this quote from Ken Boulding, things are the way they are because they got that way. It's usually a series of decisions that have led to a particular context, that have led to particular solutions. That context isn't suddenly going to disappear overnight, so you still need to deal with that situation. But secondly, there's going to be good things in there. So even if you think there might be things that you want to change, there's going to be good things that you want to retain, and you will benefit from pausing and seeing what those are before you try to change. The interesting thing, or one of the interesting things was, of course, in this context, Cucumber is our orchestrator, our test runner. It's not actually driving the browser. In this case, Selenium is driving the browser. Now, I ran a meetup in Belfast for over 10 years around Selenium. I'm a big fan of it. But Selenium is a library that automates browsers, and that's it. So whenever you see blog posts or presentations or even workshops that are doing these comparisons between Selenium and Cypress and Selenium and Playwright, they're not comparing like with like. Selenium is a library that drives the browser, and that's it. You need to add a runner, you need to add reporting, and a lot of the time you need to add some kind of abstraction layers because you're dealing with a reasonably low API that does things in the browser. The company I joined had done some of that as well. So they had some element wrappers, people typically call it. But these element wrappers weren't as foolproof as they could have been. So they were still, in small occasions, having issues with stale elements surfacing. There was race conditions on expectations. We're not dealing with the web in 2005. There's a lot of asynchronous activity happening that when you arrive on a page, it's not necessarily in the state that you expect. And then they were using Selenium 4, but they weren't using anything around the WebDriver BiDi protocol, being able to intercept or mock API responses, because an important part of stability is being able to set up state. And being able to mock and intercept your API responses is quite a powerful way to do that. But that was not in place. So I felt that, kind of based on my own experience over the last 20 years, we had quite a compelling reason to switch to using WebDriver I/O. We could do the web-first assertions, the kind of thing popularized by Playwright. We had the automatic weighting and stale element retries. Via Puppeteer, we could intercept and mock those APIs. A subset of our tests, we're an e-commerce company, a subset of our tests is important that we can actually run the same tests on mobile. And we can do that with Appium from WebDriver I/O. And going back to not all things are bad, there's a lot of really nice libraries and capabilities around making requests to APIs or to databases and things of that nature. So we still wanted to retain that, and we could do that by writing our tests in TypeScript with WebDriver I/O. But again, going back to understanding the context, things had changed before. Things had changed numerous times in the previous years. They had Selenium with C#, then they had Selenium with Java, and then being Angular front ends, Protractor with TypeScript. Of course, Protractor gets deprecated, and they shift over to using Selenium. Whenever I started broaching the idea of switching with my boss, he quite literally put his head in his hands because of this mere thought of changing yet again. Why do we still not have the test automation that we need? But I had an opportunity. So for about a year prior to me joining, there had been an attempt to use some of that existing solution for synthetic monitoring. So being able to take a subset of our tests and monitor activity or monitor the sites in production for some of our customers. But for the reasons mentioned before, things weren't quite as tight as they could have been in reliability, and there's some slowness, as we'll talk about in a second. So in that kind of initial period of time where I joined, I investigating setting up doing this in WebDriver IO. I knew I could do it based on my experience, but I wanted a compelling reason to shift. With Gherkin, if you want to run a scenario in a data-driven way, you might see something like this with an example table where for every row in the table, the scenario executes from top to bottom. In our synthetic monitoring, we wanted to be able to, for some of our customers, be able to essentially load a checkout in different countries around the world. It would be nice if we could do that in parallel rather than sequentially. With WebDriver IO, if you want to run tests in parallel, out of the box, you can do that quite easily if you specify different browsers. But we're not actually interested in different browsers, we're interested in different countries. But at the time, it's a little bit more known now, but at the time it was little known to me, is that you can specify, there's an ability to specify your own custom capabilities. So as well as saying, okay, I want to run the test in a browser, I can say, I want to run my test in this country. And just by specifying that custom : capability. So now I can have a single test that I can automatically run in parallel for different countries. So over the next month, thereabouts, we're able to run the two solutions side by side. So here's the existing Cucumber Selenium solution, and here's what I'd done with WebDriver IO, and be able to say clearly beyond doubt that we had something that was reliable, told us whenever there was an issue, and also importantly, gave us that feedback really quickly across numerous countries compared to the sequential execution. But my boss wasn't going to be writing these tests. And also this particular problem that I'd solved was for a subset of our tests. It's just for some of the production monitoring. We needed something that fitted these attributes across the board. Reliability, speed, and then some things that are maybe not talked about so much, but being intention revealing and maintainability. I was able to demonstrate that if you took away the parallel execution, at every time we did a single execution of a test, WebDriver IO was quicker than Cucumber or Selenium. But it wasn't because it was Selenium, it was because of the way things had been implemented. Those element wrappers had significant cost in terms of aiming for stability at the cost of speed. Because they weren't making some of the use of being able to intercept or mock API requests, setting up state was a little bit harder and involved inspecting the DOM for state rather than setting up state. So take all that away, and we have faster tests. But in terms of the maintainability and revealing intention, we also needed to provide guidelines. We need to provide principles and models that people could refer to think about how they should be writing their tests. We talked about Cucumber and Gherkin at the start of this presentation. Some of those ideas around what and how still make absolute sense, but we can express them in code. So we can say we are going to place an order, we are going to authorize, add items, whatever it might be. And all those low-level interactions, they should just not be in your tests, for the most part. So we make that separation. But you can't, in a sense, just say that and get it. But one of the most powerful or helpful pieces of writing that I've seen around this is from a guy called Blake Norris. And he talks about this literary idea of Chekhov's gun, the idea being that if you're an author and you're writing a book, and in the first 1 or 2 chapters, you have a gun hanging on the wall, you're compelled in the book for that gun to be fired later on. And he takes that idea and applies it to test automation and says that if there's information in your test, that information should be important. Strip away the stuff that isn't important. So if you have 1835, okay, that 1835 has meaning. But some of these ideas are quite fractal. It's not just variables. You apply this to the different layers of abstraction you might have. Apply this to your page objects. Strip away the things that don't actually matter, that do not help with describing the intent in your test. Practically, some of this, there's a whole host of design patterns that you might need to refer to, but factories, builders, but even things like having different facades that you might layer on top. If I have an e-commerce website, yes, I might have to fill in the billing address. Yes, I might have to fill in the shipping address. Yes, I might have to add an item to a cart or select a payment method. But ultimately, what I'm doing is placing an order. I might do it with Visa, I might do it with PayPal, whatever it might be. That's the test. There's a number of, I think at this stage, convinced my boss, but there's a number of other people that we needed to convince, or I needed to convince. So we have lots of different roles: developers, test automation specialists, testers. But kind of in amongst that, we have people with different mindsets. We have people who, essentially this needed to be kind of treated as a change management issue. So we're going to have people that who are going to, if we can help convince them, they will help act as champions for this change. We'll have people who are full of inertia, which we'll come to, and we'll have people that will actively resist, again, which we'll come to. But having some of the there were some developers that had been identified as being interested, attempted to improve the existing stuff with Cucumber and Selenium. So being able to talk to these people, show them that there's things that we could be doing instead that will ultimately benefit them. And it isn't just about the fact that the tests are reliable or faster or reveal intention or maintainability. It also means because of those things, you can get better feedback loops. You can get your tests included in the CI/CD pipeline. You get those tests acting as living documentation that when something goes wrong, it's less of a mystery. So being able to talk, hopefully, in the same language as some of the developers helped with that start of that conversation. Going back to Cucumber, one of the reasons given for using Cucumber was that we can make it easier for the testers. So that if we make it a little bit simpler, and going back to that idea of the natural language, perhaps they can contribute too. I'm very much of the opinion that we need to raise people up rather than bring things down for them. If we provide tools to people who are not experienced in coding, who are not experienced in some of the kind of standard development skills, as Baz says, eventually they pin themselves into a corner. So we need to bring them up, and we can do that by exposing them to patterns and ways of writing tests that will help them do that, hopefully without scaring them off, but over time, and that has happened over time, that they are contributing without the dumbing down. But we also had some resistors. So I said earlier about my boss putting his head in his hand. He had also said at one point, not long after joining, that he said something like, "Don't call my baby ugly." And I started to have that real conversation about, okay, maybe you need to think about this. But the people who'd done the work, this was also their baby. They also had such emotional attachment to what they'd done, and they felt they were solving a problem, which they were to a degree, but there's obviously more than one way to solve a problem. So being able to convince them was proven to be quite challenging. And whenever I was thinking about this, I found this book from a guy called Michael Stahl from a few years ago, And as he describes in the opening chapter, it's not that there's things in here that will apply to anybody. Your test automation doesn't have to be failing to feel the benefits of some of these ideas. The one I particularly like is around the nighttime fallacy. But the competition is really good as well, and that was the one I was using. So I'd introduced competition. I now needed to deal with what was there already. But what he talks about in the book is if different solutions have mushroomed over time, one person needs to be given control and to be able to say, this is happening. Otherwise, and this was happening to me, otherwise people will say, if they just come up with the right idea, the right reasoning, you'll be convinced. And they were trying to convince me. But I took this idea and essentially told them, this is happening. I hope you're joining me, but this is happening. And once I did that, the arguments were just gone. So where are we now? It's been probably a year now since we had last of any of our cucumber tests running. For a period of time, we had both of them, depending on the team or the domain, we had some of them running side by side for a short period. But we have test code that continues to evolve. And then importantly, with that final line, we have actual readability, but just as code rather than versus using Cucumber. So, thanks. And do you have any questions? And then I'll just put up references.
Did you have any people who, because you distinguish between tester and test automation specialist, did you have any people who exclusively did manual testing that you tried to bring into that test automation space?
Yeah, I'm personally a little bit funny with manual testing. Not trying to pick you up, but it's quite a common thing. So I just said testers in that slide. We do have people who, I guess the way I would phrase it is people who are less experienced in coding. Yes, it's been a little bit longer than I thought, but we're a reasonably sized organization. And one of the things I'm finding right now is some people still are treating test automation as just a way to run tests faster. Whereas it needs to be something that's much more integrated, kind of part of your testing process, so that some pieces are going to be useful to just do hands-on. Some people you want to involve test automation early, because, for example, if you want to test error states, well, you can mock that through test automation versus whatever confidence steps people might need to do. So trying to treat it not as just some separate step that you hand over to somebody else, but something that, okay, this may be hard, but you'll get the benefit if you treat it as something integrated. And I think that part of that is for people who are new, testers who are new to coding, they get caught up in the code naturally. But that's not the hard part. The hard part is the modeling and thinking about how you're going to put pieces together. But if you have something that's kind of like an e-commerce site where your flows are pretty standard each time, you can kind of lay over a lot of reference examples to say, okay, well, this test does most of what you need to do, refer to that, and then if your abstractions are sensible, then you can apply that in your context without doing the copy, paste, modify approach. But something that does take time, but we are getting there.
Any more questions? Great. Thanks very much, Hugh.
Cheers.